The six-party system emerged out of the chaos of 1968, when assassinations, riots, and the Vietnam War shattered the New Deal coalition. Richard Nixon's Southern strategy and promise of law and order peeled white Southerners and blue-collar workers away from the Democrats, while civil rights legislation, welfare expansion, and feminist victories tied minorities, urban liberals, and progressive reformers to the Democratic Party more firmly than ever. For the first time since Reconstruction, the South shifted toward the Republicans, while Black America became the Democratic Party's most loyal bloc. Politics was no longer about broad coalitions holding the center. It became a battle over culture, race, class, and identity. Before 1968, the Black family had endured segregation and poverty with remarkable resilience. As the Moynihan Report, 1965, observed, nearly 75% of Black children were raised in two-parent households, a strength that anchored communities despite systemic barriers. But in the years after 1968, with the expansion of welfare programs and rapid social upheaval, family stability began to fracture, and out-of-wedlock births rose sharply. These changes were not the natural result of race or history, but of policy choices that undermined work, marriage, and responsibility in poor communities. The contrast between pre-1968 resilience and post-1968 dependency became one of the most profound and uncomfortable legacies of the era, shaping both politics and culture in the Black American community. Yet beneath the slogans and rallies, a quieter revolution was underway. The Supreme Court reshaped society with rulings like Roe v. Wade, universities incubated new theories of race and gender, and the federal government embedded itself more deeply into education, welfare, and healthcare. As the six-party system unfolded, the media became more than just a storyteller. It became a shaper of reality. Television news amplified every protest, riot, and scandal, magnifying conflict in ways no earlier generation had seen. Through repeated images, selective framing, and the elevation of radical ideas from campuses into mainstream debate, the mainstream media would begin helping embed concepts tied to Marxism and class struggle into the national conversation. Politics would no longer be just about laws and elections, it would become about reshaping how Americans perceive the truth itself. Republicans promised law and order, Democrats promised justice and equality, but both parties leaned into division as their strategy. The six-party system was not simply a new voter alignment, it was the beginning of politics as permanent conflict, where media-driven perception carried as much weight as the Constitution itself. In 1969, Richard Nixon entered the White House promising to restore law and order to a nation scarred by riots, assassinations, and Vietnam. His first term delivered surprising foreign policy triumphs. He opened relations with China, easing a quarter-century of hostility, and negotiated arms control agreements with the Soviet Union through SALT I. Nixon also oversaw the eventual drawdown of U.S. forces in Vietnam, though the war's agony lingered. At home, his record was mixed. He enforced desegregation in Southern schools faster than any predecessor, signed the Environmental Protection Agency into law, and expanded social programs like food stamps, surprising moves for a Republican. Yet, his attempt to curb inflation through wage and price controls faltered, and unrest over Vietnam continued to divide the country. Nixon's presidency was a paradox, conservative in rhetoric, but pragmatic in action. Re-elected in 1972 in a landslide, Nixon seemed at the height of his power, but his second term unraveled with breathtaking speed. The Watergate scandal, a bungled burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters tied to his re-election campaign, revealed a web of cover-ups, secret recordings, and abuses of power. Investigations by Congress and the press exposed a president willing to bend the Constitution to protect himself. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned in August 1974, becoming the first U.S. president to step down from office. His fall shook the nation's trust in government and marked the end of an era of presidential dominance that had stretched back to Franklin Roosevelt. Watergate brought it all crashing down. Nixon's resignation proved the Constitution's design still held. The president was not above the law. Nixon's law and order strategy cemented a permanent shift. Instead of debating how to govern, American politics became a battle over culture, identity, and control of public perception. The 1970s marked the height of second-wave feminism, a movement that sought to redefine the role of women in American society. Unlike the suffragists of the early 20th century, these activists pushed beyond voting rights to demand equality in work, education, and personal freedom. Leaders such as Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, and Bella Abzug became household names, speaking of consciousness raising and the need to dismantle systemic sexism. In 1972, Congress passed Title IX, prohibiting sex discrimination in federally funded education, opening the door for women in athletics and academia. Feminists celebrated these gains as essential steps toward equality, but critics warned that they were blurring the natural distinctions of family life and undermining institutions that gave society stability. The courts became another battleground. In 1973, Roe v. Wade established abortion as a constitutional right, reshaping the moral and political landscape of the nation. Supporters hailed it as liberation from male control over women's bodies, while opponents saw it as judicial overreach, a court creating new rights not found in the Constitution. At the same time, the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, gained momentum, promising to enshrine gender equality in the Constitution. By 1977, it had been ratified by 35 states, just 3 short of the required 38. But a counter-movement, led by figures like Phyllis Schlafly, mobilized women who believed feminism threatened family, faith, and traditional values. Their activism stalled the ERA, proving that not all women were marching under the same banner. Supporters hailed it as liberation. Opponents called it legalized infanticide. The ruling polarized the nation and became a permanent fault line in American politics. Feminism reshaped family, work, and faith. Traditional roles were challenged, divorce rates rose, and cultural conservatives rallied to defend the family as they understood it. Churches mobilized against abortion, birthing the religious right, a movement that would become a Republican cornerstone. Roe v. Wade wasn't just about abortion, it shifted constitutional interpretation itself. Instead of grounding rights in the explicit text of the Constitution, the court invented privacy rights through judicial activism, setting a precedent for courts to legislate from the bench. Jimmy Carter entered the White House in 1977 as a political outsider, promising honesty and moral leadership in the wake of Watergate. A former Georgia governor and a devout Baptist, he embodied humility and personal integrity, traits Americans craved after years of scandal and distrust. Carter achieved notable successes early in his presidency. He brokered the historic Camp David Accords, 1978, between Egypt and Israel, the first peace agreement between the two nations. He promoted human rights as a central pillar of U.S. foreign policy, and he deregulated industries like airlines, banking, and trucking, opening markets and lowering consumer costs. His efforts to shift America toward renewable energy and conservation also showed foresight, as he famously installed solar panels on the White House roof. Yet Carter struggled to translate personal decency into political effectiveness, often clashing with Congress, even with his own Democratic Party. Domestically, Carter faced mounting crises he could not overcome. His administration battled stagflation, the painful mix of high inflation, high unemployment, and slow growth, while gas shortages left Americans sitting in long lines at service stations. In 1979, his crisis of confidence speech, later called the Malaise speech, urged Americans to consume less and renew their spirit, but many interpreted it as a sign of weakness. Later that year, the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah, a key U.S. ally, and militants seized the American embassy in Tehran, taking 52 hostages. For 444 days the nation watched helplessly as the crisis dragged on, undermining Carter's authority and humiliating the country on the world stage. His handling of these events cemented his image as a leader overwhelmed by forces he could not control. One of Carter's most lasting domestic legacies was the creation of the Department of Education in 1979. Since the 19th century, education policy had largely been controlled at the state and local level, but Carter believed federal oversight was needed to ensure equal access and enforce civil rights protections in schools. The department consolidated scattered federal education programs into one agency, giving Washington new power to shape national education policy. Supporters praised it as a step toward fairness and consistency, particularly for minority and disadvantaged students. Critics, however, saw it as federal overreach, fearing that education would become politicized and divorced from local values. This tension, between opportunity and control, equality and autonomy, foreshadowed the cultural battles that would dominate the sixth-party system. Carter's presidency ended in 1980 with defeat at the hands of Ronald Reagan, but the Department of Education remained, shaping classrooms and controversies for decades to come. Ronald Reagan came to power in 1981 with a simple but electrifying promise to restore America's greatness. After a decade of inflation, energy crises, and shaken confidence, he declared that government was the problem, not the solution. His vision of lower taxes, strong defense, and renewed optimism resonated across the country, earning him the nickname, the Great Communicator. Reagan's first term saw an economic revival as inflation dropped, jobs returned, and the Cold War entered a new phase of confrontation. Abroad, he projected strength against the Soviet Union, famously calling it an evil empire. Yet by his second term, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Mikhail Gorbachev, signing the INF Treaty and helping to bring the Cold War to a close. Reagan's America was bold, confident, and ready once again to lead the world. The 1980s saw the rise of Black American influence in politics, culture, and business. Black entrepreneurship grew, the number of Black elected officials doubled, and leaders like Jesse Jackson mounted serious presidential campaigns. In pop culture, Michael Jackson became a global superstar, Oprah Winfrey built a media empire, and hip-hop emerged as the raw voice of the streets, capturing the struggles of a new generation. At the same time, workplaces began experimenting with diversity training as lawsuits and legislation pushed organizations to address discrimination. These were signs of progress and recognition, yet they unfolded alongside a darker reality, the spread of crack cocaine in inner cities. Cheap, addictive, and devastating, crack brought crime, family breakdown, and despair. Reagan responded with the war on drugs, a campaign that aimed to restore order but imposed harsh mandatory sentences that disproportionately affected Black communities. The result was a paradox. While Black Americans gained unprecedented visibility in politics, culture, and business, their neighborhoods were being hollowed out by addiction and mass incarceration. Rap music, from Grandmaster Flash's The Message to Public Enemy's Fight the Power, carried inner-city voices into the public square, demanding the nation hear the cries of the marginalized. Reagan left office in 1989 with high approval ratings, remembered as the man who revived American pride and helped end the Cold War. Reagan's legacy would inspire future senators, governors, and presidents in keeping strong to the traditions of the Republican Party. The late 1970s and early 1980s marked the birth of mainstream televised news as a permanent fixture of American life. With the launch of CNN in 1980, the first 24-hour cable news channel, information was no longer confined to nightly broadcasts. It became an around-the-clock spectacle. Crises like the Iranian hostage situation, the Challenger explosion, and global conflicts unfolded live in living rooms, reshaping how Americans experienced history. This constant flow of information transformed perception. Politics became less about what happened, and more about how it was shown, replayed, and interpreted on screen. Trust in news shifted from local papers to national anchors, making media not just a messenger but a gatekeeper of reality. The impact was profound. News networks began to develop specialties that carved out niches in American political and cultural life, each shaping public opinion in different ways. What emerged was not only a battle for ratings, but a battle for authority. Who defined truth, who framed the story, and who could capture the nation's trust? In the sixth-party system, politics became inseparable from television, and perception often mattered more than substance. Americans were no longer just voters, they were an audience, and politics was the show. The media started with 5 mainstream news outlets, each having its own lane. CNN, 1980, pioneered the 24-hour news cycle, specializing in live, breaking coverage of national and global crises. ABC News rose in prominence with Nightline offering in-depth late-night analysis, especially on the Iranian hostage crisis. NBC News marketed credibility through long-form reporting and investigative journalism, anchored by figures like Tom Brokaw. CBS News positioned itself as the serious, traditional network of record, with anchors like Walter Cronkite and later Dan Rather embodying authority. PBS NewsHour, public broadcasting, offered slower, more analytical coverage, appealing to viewers seeking context over spectacle. Their impact would last for the next 4 decades. George H.W. Bush entered the White House in 1989, promising a kinder, gentler nation and stability after the Reagan Revolution. His presidency was defined abroad by dramatic events: the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the swift U.S.-led victory in the Persian Gulf War. These triumphs gave him towering approval ratings and the aura of steady leadership in uncertain times. Yet at home the economy slowed, deficits grew, and his 1988 campaign pledge, "Read my lips, no new taxes," became the breaking point of his political career when he agreed to raise them. By 1992, Bush was a president caught between global success and domestic disappointment, vulnerable to a changing culture he struggled to understand. Meanwhile, feminism and media were reshaping the national conversation. The Anita Hill hearings in 1991, where Hill accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment, electrified the country and gave rise to what many called the Year of the Woman in 1992, as a wave of female candidates ran for office. Feminism moved beyond workplace equality into broader debates about power, sexuality, and representation. At the same time, the media was becoming more aggressive, feeding a 24-hour news cycle that transformed politics into spectacle. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, black political life was firmly shaped by the legacy of the civil rights era. Elected officials and activists carried forward the tactics of protest, legal pressure, and coalition building that had been pioneered by the NAACP and leaders like Webb Du Bois. In Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus pressed for expanded welfare, affirmative action, housing subsidies, and stronger voting rights protections, framing these demands as the next chapter of civil rights. Universities played a powerful role in this shift. Campuses that once had been battlegrounds for civil rights now became incubators for Black Power thought and the academic frameworks of critical race theory. Emerging in law schools in the late 1980s, CRT argued that racism was not merely a matter of individual prejudice, but a structural, permanent feature of American life. This perspective gave activists and policymakers a new vocabulary: systemic racism, privilege, equity, that would ripple into politics, education, and corporate America in the years ahead. The Black Power movement's earlier emphasis on identity, cultural pride, and resistance found new life in these academic theories, which increasingly informed how black elected officials framed their policies and rhetoric. Civil rights had begun in the church and the courtroom, but by the Bush years its intellectual center of gravity was shifting toward the university lecture hall. By 1992, economic pain, cultural conflict, and political fatigue had eroded the old Nixon-Reagan coalition. Into this breach stepped Bill Clinton, a young Democrat from Arkansas who spoke the language of middle-class pragmatism. His victory ended Republican dominance and ushered in the third-way politics of the 1990s. The six-party system had redefined America. The South was now Republican. Minorities in northern cities were Democratic. Feminism, Roe v. Wade, diversity training, and the media revolution had reshaped family, education, and politics. The Constitution remained, but its interpretation was increasingly molded not by voters or legislators but by courts, bureaucracies, and media. The battles of the six-party system weren't only about elections, they were about who controlled America's mind. Education, media, and law became the real levers of power, quietly shifting the foundation of democracy from the consent of the governed to the management of the governed.